Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're continuing our coverage of the 2020 US Chess Championships. We are in round number 7, the start of day number 3. So I've had first 2 days, they play 3 rounds every single day. Today is the exact same, so playing round 7, 8, and 9. Our competitors, White's going to be played by Jeffery Xiong. We did watch him get a victory on day number 1, and his opponent playing the black pieces is Nakamura. Nakamura is the defending champion of this tournament, and in last year's tournament, he actually beat Jeffery Xiong. He needed to beat him in the final round to actually win the tournament. And in that same game, Jeffery had the white pieces and Nakamura had the black pieces, and Nakamura was able to come out with the victory. In this tournament, Jeffery's having a better game. And while we talked a lot about Wesley So and how he sits atop of the leaderboard, Jeffery is half a point behind him, and Jeffery's undefeated. He has 4 wins and 2 draws. Now, Wesley So coming into day 3 has 5 wins and 1 draw, but Jeffery has a lot going for him and looking to get some revenge on Nakamura. So let's go ahead and get started. Jeffery begins with e4. Always fun to see that from the competitors. G6, d4, and then we get into the perk defense here with d6. Knight to f3. Knight f6, and then knight c3. So getting into the 2 knights variation, the classical system against the perk defense, bishop to g7. So fianchettoing that bishop to the king side. Bishop to e3, which usually lends towards the queen coming to d2. If white wants to castle on the queen side, has that option. Pawn d6, c6, queen to d2. And then pawn b5. So, may give a slight pause to white castling queen side already, just because there's so much pressure coming on the queen side from these pawns from Nakamura. So we do see Jeffery play bishop to d3. Just give him some options. He can now castle on the king side if he wants to. Now Nakamura continues with knight to d7, just getting more material involved into the game. Knight's blocked here on a c6, so not coming to the most natural square that you see the knights, but this also defends the knight here on f6. And this variation, you're usually going to see the bishop coming here to b7, trying to control these light squares in the center of the board. We see h3, just stopping this knight coming down to g4 at some point, which can be troublesome, starting to attack the white's king side. Now a5, we do see some exchange in the center of the board, and then after a4, this lets us know Jeffery's probably not going to be castling on the queen side anymore, starting to chip away at the queen side structure that Nakamura has. Nakamura not looking to trade, instead push forwards with b4, attacking the knight. And usually once a side pushes the pawns past this halfway point, they usually want to solidify that pawn chain because it is a little more extended than they may like. So that's exactly what we see. And we see a5 solidifying that pawn chain. And after c3, Nakamura doubles down here with c5. Now the bishop here on e3 is attacking the pawn, and the knight here on d7 is defending that. So always good to understand what pieces and material you are attacking and what material your opponent is defending that with. So if you're looking for moves like deflection moves, or you're looking for forking moves or pinning down material, things like that are always good, because let's say that white wanted to pin down this knight. That would then make it very difficult for the knight to then hold on to this pawn here on c5. So those are the things that you should be looking at in your own game. So we see Jeffery castle on the king side, and then Nakamura castles as well. Now, since both sides have really developed all their material, yes, the bishop here on c8 has not moved yet, but for the most part, both sides are kind of locked in. And this is all known theory so far, so you may hear terms like book move. Both of these players are familiar with this position, and now we start to get into some novelty as far as how Jeffery wants to play this game based on his preparation. So these players not taking a lot of time getting to this spot. And so as you advance in chess, learning the openings where you're not spending a ton of time on that is a huge focus that you should have. But as far as some of the moves, one move that I really like is bishop to b4. So you have the bishops in the center. They're not doing too much right now. We've already talked about the knight here on d7 is defending the pawn on c5, which is attacked by the bishop here on e3. So I always like to attack pieces that are defending other pieces on the board. This is a great outpost for this bishop, and also it baits this knight here on f6 from coming here to e4 because, as we just mentioned, always looking at what material is defending other material. This bishop here on d3 is defending the pawn here on e4. As soon as that bishop moves to b5, it's no longer defending that. And it almost looks like a mistake, but knight to e4, capturing that pawn, would be a blunder because now the queen can come up here to d5. It's not only attacking the knight here on e4, but it's attacking the rook here on a8. And there's just no real good options that black has to stop this. They're definitely going to go down in material. So that's not going to work. This is going to be much better than, bishop to c4. And you can see why, because the bishop's no longer protected by that pawn. That's why the outpost, even though the pawn's here on a4, is extremely valuable, because now the knight can take here on e4. And even if the queen comes up to d5, it's just not going to go as well, because now knight to b6. Whereas before, the queen could just come back here and take on e4, and that's all fine and well. But now after he does that, then the bishop could fall here on c4. There could be some in-between moves. Bishop to f5, queen comes over here to h4. They could even exchange material off, but eventually this bishop here on c4 is going to fall. Previous example with the bishop here on b5, it's not going to happen. So that's just one example of how these players are studying these positions even before the tournament is going on. Other things you could see would be maybe rook to d1. Always want to get your rooks in the center of the board, and if there's a semi-open file or an open file, that's a good spot to have it. You could just take here on b4, makes a lot of sense. Pawn takes, opening up for the rook to attack here on a4. So I'd probably just secure that with b3. I think that makes sense. One thing that you don't want to be doing is something like bishop to g5. I'd still want to keep pressure on this c5 square. This is not going to work out as well because this is a nice little deflection. So yes, this knight is being pinned down right here, but after the bishop takes here, then all of a sudden the knight can take here on e4, and yes, the knight was pinned down, but now the knight's attacking the queen here as well as the bishop here on g5. So none of those are going to work out well on g5. So it's definitely not what Jeffery's looking to do. The other option which he chose in the game is knight to g3. Nakamura responds with bishop to b7, putting another attacker on this e4 square, but that's exactly what the knight here on g3 is also defending. Rook over here to d1, as we talked about. Want to centralize your rooks here. Queen to e7. Rook here to c1, rook over here to c1 as well. Had a couple options as far as where Nakamura wanted to bring the rooks. We do start to see some of the pawns come off the board here, and then bishop to c4, and this is pinning down this pawn here on f7 to the king. And while that threat right now is not the strongest, once some material starts coming off the board, this bishop can be a real problem for black to deal with. Knight to f8, and many times if you've been watching this channel for a lot of years, we've been doing this for maybe 11 years now, which is kind of crazy to think about. But as I've analyzed so many of these games, you always recognize that when players retreat like this, they bring their knights back here to the 8th rank. They're usually trying to set up some additional maneuvers, and the good players always strike. And that's exactly what Jeffery does in this position. He knows that he needs to be aggressive because Nakamura is on his back foot. So he plays queen to d6, and after the exchange, he has a rook all up in his opponent's position. Rook to c7, just trying to eye down this f7 square, which is under attack, and then rook to b6. Now, part of the reason for rook to b6 is, let's analyze this position right here, because there's no reason to play queen up here to d6, exchange queens, unless you have a very strong idea in mind. But you could be looking at it and say, well, why don't you just play knight takes here on e5? because this sets up the knight and the bishop both attacking the pawn here on f7, although it is protected by the rook here on c7. But that leaves this pawn here on e4 under attack. Now you could still come up here, take on f7. The rook could take the bishop here on c4. There could be some exchanges going on, but at the end of the day, this is not going to be extremely beneficial for white. Jeffery kind of runs out of ideas at this spot, and now Nakamura has the bishop pair. Definitely not what you want for Nakamura to have going into the endgame with an open board state. So instead, Jeffery first plays rook to b6, which gets the rook out of harm's way if the knight comes here to e4, because then that knight would no longer be attacking the rook. The rook is now attacking his bishop here on b7. Still has all the other threats that he has, and then rook to e8. Now this is defending this pawn here on e5, but Jeffery has another way to attack this, and that's with knight to g5. Not worried about this pawn anymore. He's looking for the attack, not the material here. So still has the knight and the bishop still eyeing down on this f7 square. You can see the knight here on f8 has never been able to move and actually get into the action, while Jeffery has just been able to chip away and get a better position. Bishop comes back here to a8. Rook over here to a6, attacking both the bishop and the pawn here on a5. Bishop to b7. Rook takes on a5. Jeffery chipping away here, gobbling up some material here. Bishop to a8. You can tell Nakamura is not really doing too much as far as improving his position, just kind of moving his bishop back and forth, losing some material, while Jeffery continues to get the position he wants. Bishop comes back here to b3. This bishop is nicely placed. This rook here is defending the pawn here on f7. So he says, hey, if you want to go and exchange material here, that's fine. I'm up in material, so it's always a good thing to exchange down if you have an advantage. But also to get that rook off the 7th rank, that would also be a good thing for Jeffery. Nakamura is not having it correctly and plays rook to d7. Rook to a6 from Jeffery. Pawn to h6, attacking this knight. But then the knight takes here on f7. A huge opportunity for Jeffery to be extremely aggressive. Bishop takes here on f7. The king takes, and then rook to c7. And you can start to see that Jeffery has a massive attack coming, and it's very difficult for Nakamura to hold on to this. You can still see that knight here on f8. Jeffery has never let Black get back into this game. King to g8. Rook over here to a7, attacking the bishop. Now Black takes the pawn here on e4, trying to get something back, but it's just too late. The rook takes here on f6, takes the knight here, saying that, yeah, you can go ahead and take my rook, which Nakamura almost has to do, but then he loses the bishop here on e4, attacking the bishop. The bishop comes back here to d8, and then rook to a8 is the final move, not in the game, but as far as giving up all hope for Nakamura to do anything, because how does he really move any of this material here? He can't move his bishop because as soon as he does, his rook is going to fall. If he moves his rook, well, then the bishop is going to fall. And what I find ironic is that the last piece moved in the game before resignation is the knight to e6. I feel like Black was almost thinking like, hey, you had me stick with my knight there on f8, and I'm about to resign, because Nakamura did resign after this one move. But he's like, before I resign, I want to move that knight, because I'm not going to let you just have me keep my knight here on f8. I gotta move it. So after this, he does resign because there's no way to stop the move that he knows is coming, and that is knight to f6. This is a deflection. If the bishop takes here on f6, you can see the rook is going to fall. Very easy in game for Jeffery. If doesn't take, maybe king to f7. In that case, the knight takes here on e8. King takes, that's fine. Bishop takes here on h6, gobbles up material. Pretty easy in game for Jeffery. So, what a game by Jeffery. Gets the victory in round number 7 to start off day 3, having a fantastic tournament. And to get that against Nakamura, the defending champion. I mean, he's a teenager going against the very best, one of the best players in the world, but definitely the reigning champion. Has got to feel really, really good. So congratulations to him. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Maybe you even learned something. Hopefully you did. But thanks so much, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for the final day of the US Chess Championship.